first? Part 2, Understanding Abortion. Stephen D. Schwarz, Professor Schwarz, welcome again.
Thank you.
And Kiki,
Thank you. Thank
Kiki
you for having
Latimer.
us. Thank you for having us.
It's a wonderful book. It's about it is the finest compendium of arguments on both sides of the debate. And it's really fascinating. We were talking last week about footnote 54 in the Roe versus Wade decision, where Justice Blackmun, who wrote the decision, said that if the unborn child is declared a person, then all the rights of a person are immediately attached to the child. Talk for a minute about the humanity of the unborn child. What do we know about the biology of an unborn child?
Okay, we go over the biological development at the very beginning in the first chapter, the introductory chapter. The last part of that is facts about the being in the womb. But that is neutral between the two stands. Those facts are presented in such a way that they can be accepted both by the pro-life position, which says that that's a child, that that's a small human being in the sense of a human person, that just as a 5-year-old is a younger human being than a 20-year-old, so a child in the womb is younger than a 5-year-old, but it's basically the same kind of being. And it can also be accepted by the Tooley, Marianne Warren and Tooley pro-choice position, which acknowledges that the being in the womb is a human being, but interprets that as in a biological sense. It's biologically human. It's a member of the human species and not of another species. But as they all argue, Marianne Warren and Michael Tooley and later David Boonin, species membership by itself is not morally relevant. It doesn't make you a person. So there is a significant development, but the question still remains whether it is the development of a biologically human being, an organism that will achieve personhood at some point, in some way parallel to becoming a doctor. And that's clearly an achievement. You're not born a doctor. You go first to college with pre-med, and then you go to medical school, and you go through various training programs, and through that you achieve something which is signified by MD, and then that gives you certain rights. So being a doctor is certainly an achievement, and for the pro-choice position as represented by Marianne Warren, Michael Tooley, being a person is in a parallel way an achievement. It's not something in the nature of the being. It is something that comes only later with various achievements, mostly formulated in terms of intrinsic properties of the being, in some cases relational, that is accepted by the human community. The pro-life position, as I mentioned briefly before, is that human life is a continuum, and it is made up of different phases, one of them being childhood, and then later you have adolescence and teen, and then young adult and middle age, and older people, and there are no exact lines there, but they're not really necessary. They are all phases of one and the same person. So I am now an elderly person, and I was once a middle-aged person, I was once a young person, I was once a college student, and then high school student, and in my own case, I was a first grader in France, because my parents were originally from Europe. We lived in France. Well, that's a whole long story, which we can't get into here, but I was born in Germany. My parents left in protest against Hitler. The important point is that that was me. That was me, born in Germany in 1932, just before Hitler came to power, and then that was me a little bit later, going to school in Limoges in France.
Do you remember your French?
Oh, I remember it. I remember the episode. I forgot
all my college French.
The important point is that it's one and the same being.
Yes. Personal identity.
I didn't achieve being a person. I was a person already then, even though I couldn't do many of the things that I now can do. So I think you can't turn to biology for an answer to the question of personhood. That's a philosophical question. And it's ultimately the question whether we are persons in our very nature, that we are conceived as persons and then simply develop, or whether personhood is something that's achieved in a way somewhat comparable to being a doctor. And I think one very interesting, and that gets us also back to the when does a person begin, is by asking what I do in the book, the conceived question. There's two ways of looking at it. You can say, my parents conceived me, and that would be the pro-life position. My parents conceived me, and at that moment I was very small, I was undeveloped, but that's to be expected at the very beginning, that development takes time and actually goes rather rapidly, as is illustrated here. Their eyes are already present at 19 days, and the heart beats even earlier, and so on. Or whether my parents conceived an organism that later became me, which is what you have to say if you take the Marianne Warren, Michael Tooley position, that what you have at the very beginning is a biological organism, which then later, when sufficient development has taken place, achieves personhood, and it doesn't have the rights of a person, it doesn't have the right to life until that's achieved. And that's what justifies abortion. So that they say, yes, we're killing a human being, but we're killing only a biological organism, we're not killing a person.
That is interesting. Although there's something about it that doesn't feel right to me. I remember a discussion that took place on the radio with a former state representative, Billy McKenna. He was on the radio as a caller when an executive director of an abortion facility was on taking questions. And Billy said to her, what is the being now? And she said, it's a potential human life. And then Billy said, at 9 weeks, there are fingerprints. At 18 days, there's a heartbeat. At 10 weeks, there's a sense of touch, of comfort and pain. At 12 weeks, a baby can smile, suck his or her thumb, and make a fist. And what is it now? And she couldn't answer. She didn't answer. And the call was terminated, and they went on to another caller. But what do the pro-choice of abortion people do? Well, some people would object to my use of the word pro-choice of abortion. They'd say, well, they're not necessarily choosing abortion. They're just allowing the choice of abortion. But see, the thing is, there is an allowance of the choice of abortion. So there is a pro-choice of abortion there. What do the pro-choice of abortion people do with the human body inside the womb?
Well, they're saying it's just a body. It's just a body, no different than a monkey's body. A monkey can do those things. A starfish can do those things. So the question is, just because you have a body, not necessarily do you have a person. And that's what they're going to separate those two ideas, so that you have biological human life. You've got the DNA, you've got 46 chromosomes, but you don't have somebody home. There's not a spirit, a soul, a mind, a person there. That's going to come in later. Either through brain development or birth, or something, put somebody in there. But they're going to say that nobody's home, and that's what the Supreme Court said, that even though you have this biological development all the way up till the moment of birth, nobody's in that body until it's born, and then some person gets put into it. I mean, that's the ruling of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court never denied that it's biologically human, just that there's not a person there. There's not a you, an I there.
Is there any feeling of sympathy or consistency on the part of pro-choice of abortion people to the same application being made to beings at the other end of life? A person who has Alzheimer's and dementia, they're not fully functioning either. In fact, they may be functioning at a very small level. Can they be considered non-persons as well?
Okay, Michael Tooley takes up that objection, and his definition of person is a being who now has the capacity to say I and to communicate, and who has a sense of self, and a desire for continued existence either has that now or has had it in the past. And that's also how they get around the objection, well, then you could kill a sleeping person because they're not saying I and they're not communicating, they're not doing all those things, or someone even more drastically, someone who's under total anesthesia. They would say, well, they had it in the past. And so either now or had it in the past. And so someone who takes Tooley's position might not be sympathetic to euthanasia, that is, they could consistently, so I think Kevorkian didn't have really much of a basis there. They could consistently oppose euthanasia on the basis or with the claim that that is a person because they functioned as a person in the past. And they don't have to do it now, but they did in the past, and that counts. And the pro-life reply to that is, why do you count only the past? Why not the future? Isn't the future also important? And in some senses, almost more important, that you're denying life to a being who will be able to function as a person, do all the things that Marianne Warren and Michael Tooley want. And in fact, there's an argument, a famous argument by Don Marquis, who says abortion is wrong even if we don't decide the question of whether that being is a person now. What is clear is that that being has a future as a person, and if you destroy that being now, even if it's not a person now, you're destroying its future. So he's called that the future like ours argument, and that's a very interesting argument that tries to bypass the whole dispute about personhood and say abortion is wrong because it destroys a being's future. And so he kind of balances the things off, where Tooley had only considered the past, he now considers the future. And then the future is very important, and lawsuits are sometimes decided on that. When a young person is injured and perhaps paralyzed, they sue on the basis of the future earnings that that person would have had. As the person's 20 years old, they would have had a career of 40 years, and they could have made so much money. Yes. They were a promising young attorney or doctor, and so we're going to sue for the wage, and a very reasonable position. And so I think the future does need to be considered.
You know, we talked a little bit last week about something that a famous abortionist who became pro-life, the late Bernard Nathanson, said. He said that if the wombs had windows, then abortion will end. And ultrasound and sonograms are helping technology bring us to a more visual relationship with the unborn children. I got a photo the other day on the email. One of my sons is a dad now. His baby is to be born in April. But the baby in the ultrasound was waving, hello, and it was a kind of a neat picture. Carol Everett was a former abortionist, an executive director, I think, of an abortion facility. Abby Johnson was also an official with an abortion facility.
We mentioned her.
She wrote Unplanned. It's a book that she wrote. In Abby Johnson's case, and I think maybe Carol Everett's case too, there was somebody who was telling me, telling an audience, I should say, that in an abortion attempt, the child in the womb was moving the instrument of the abortionist away and fleeing to the opposite side of the womb to
they do try to avoid it, yes.
To avoid it. What a remarkable, talk for a minute about the pain of abortion. That's in the book.
It is. Go ahead, Dr. Suni Anand.
Yeah, that is certainly a factor to be considered in later abortions, where scientific developments have very strongly suggested that the neurological structures and the brain structures are in place so that the being in the womb, even if it's not a person, can feel pain. And so I think that is a very important consideration in abortion, and it applies, I think, in particular to partial birth abortion and other abortions which take place at the same time as partial birth abortions, but inside the woman, where the being in the womb is cut to pieces with a knife, and it has nerve endings, and it must be absolutely horrendous pain. In the case of partial birth abortion, the baby is largely out, and the doctor takes scissors and pierces the skull. And many people, including pro-choice people, are horrified by that. I mentioned our former representative, Patrick Kennedy, who is pro-choice but was opposed to partial birth, and many other people who call themselves pro-choice, you know, pro-choice in the early and perhaps middle stages, but in the late stages, that is such a barbaric procedure that I think people would be revolted if that were done to animals, if that were done to a cat
against
or
the
a
law
dog.
to do it to a dog.
And where you're not claiming that the cat or dog is a person, you're just saying it's a being that has feelings.
Yes.
And you're causing this horrendous pain.
Yes.
And you wonder why, if the woman doesn't want to remain pregnant, then just take the child out.
Right, that's
and
the interesting
let it
thing.
live.
That's the very interesting thing about partial birth abortion is that the fetus, the child, whatever you want to call it, the being in the womb is 3/4 of the way out. Everything is out except for the head. So all you have to do at that point, if she just wants to get rid of it, or if there's reasons like life of the mother, or it was a case of rape or incest, is pull it all the way out and pop it into an incubator. It's viable generally at that point. If it's not, it's not, but you do the best you can. So the question is, why, when it's out, do you need to kill it? It's a very, very interesting question with partial birth abortion. Why are you doing that at that point?
One of the authors, was it Thompson, who was pro-choice, said that even though she was pro-choice, it was the violinist argument. Even though she was pro-choice, she said that she didn't think that anyone had the right to a dead baby.
Right, right. Yeah, she says with the violinist, if you detach yourself from him and he still lives, you don't have a right to slit his throat.
Yeah.
So she's very clear about that. Well, on a number of other things, she sides with pro-life. She claims that you don't have an absolute right to an abortion, and she claims that that's an advantage of her argument. But mainly, she says you don't have a right to a dead baby. You only have a right to be freed from the burden of pregnancy. But many people have argued that what at least some women, and perhaps many, I don't know most, but some women at least, I don't know how many, but they don't want to simply be not pregnant. They don't want there to be a child.
Yes.
Because if there were a child, they would have to take care of it, or they would have to give it up for adoption. And once it's born, they have a bond with it, and they don't want to give it up, which in a way is a very strange thing, that you love the child so much that you can't bear to separate yourself from him and give the child for adoption, and yet you're willing to kill the child. So there's something, we haven't plumbed all the depths of this thing, but that is something that has always puzzled me. That, how can you love a being so much that you wouldn't give it up, and yet be willing to have it killed? There are many persons that I don't like all that much, but please don't kill them.
Yes.
Don't kill them. I will give my life so that they're not killed.
There's a case in the news right now, a fellow by the name of Powell, who is under the suspicion of murdering his wife.
His wife, Susan Powell?
Yeah.
Oh, that Susan Powell case. Yeah.
He killed both his children.
Unbelievable. I just staggering.
The autopsies are indicating that he did it with a hatchet first, before the house was set on fire. And his argument in one of his emails was, I can't live without my kids, so I have to take them with me into death.
Almost, I would say, working in the pregnancy agency for 20 years, almost every woman who chose abortion would say, I have to have an abortion because if I carry to term, I will love this baby too much to give it up for adoption. And we just heard that over and over again.
Fascinating.
And I think that's that connection that many people don't make between an unwanted pregnancy and an unwanted child. That it's very often, for most women, yes, there are women who want they want a dead baby, and that's the Thompson thing. But for many women, it's the pregnancy that's unwanted. And they recognize full well that the child would not be unwanted, and they don't know how to deal with that because they don't have a support system. So many women choose abortion because of the lack of a support system. family members, boyfriends, husbands, siblings who are not
pressured.
supportive. They're pressured.
Pressured.
And almost all of them say, it's very interesting because we use the word pro-choice, but most women who are choosing abortion, almost, I would say 100% will use the term words, I have no choice. I have to have an abortion because fill in the blank. Because of some lack of support, lack of money, lack of people supporting them. I have to have an abortion. I have no choice.
Sounds like they're using it as an excuse.
It's not an excuse. It's a very painful decision that women make. I don't think it's an excuse. I think it's very real. They don't feel that they have support by society, by family.
Yes, sometimes there's. I remember I watched this. I was at an abortion facility one time, and there was a girl who appeared to be a teenager. I think she seemed to be a high school student or a teenager. And she wanted to come over to the pro-life people and get some information about options. An adult male, I don't know who he was, a father or an uncle or whomever it might have been,
pulled her back,
came over to her and grabbed her by her beautiful hair and dragged her by her hair into the abortion facility. Now that might be illegal,
I think it
but
is.
trying to get a police action on a case like that at that point could prove difficult. I imagine if it was a parent, a parent has a lot of influence.
But legally, a woman has choice, and that cuts both ways.
Yes.
That you can't stop her from having an abortion if she chooses an abortion, but you also can't force her to have an abortion. And I think a consistent pro-choicer ought to be, equally strong on both sides. They ought to condemn the China policy of forced abortions. I don't see that happening the way it should, but that's a place where pro-life and pro-choice can come together.
Yeah.
Pro-life and pro-choice can come together against the Chinese policy of forced abortions. That's anti-choice, anti-woman. So,
you do speak at churches and
yes, we want to speak at churches and schools and civic clubs, Rotary clubs, and places like that. We want to get the word out. We want the book, not for our own personal sake, but because we believe that the issue is very, very important, and that very often people act on the issue with a lack of information. They're not really fully informed. They kind of follow the crowd. They're in a certain cultural setting, and that tends to be pro-choice, so they're pro-choice. Or they're in a cultural setting, cultural environment, which tends to be pro-life, so they follow along, like the herd, followed it. And I think that that's unfortunate, because I think it's an issue that people ought to decide on their own. And perhaps part company with their friends and their church maybe. They're all on one side, but I have looked at this, and I have done this in my own life. I have examined all the positions that were taught to me as a child, and for the most part, I have adopted the same positions, but in a few cases, I have not. I said, no, I think they're mistaken on that. And I think ultimately what we should be guided by is the search for truth, the love of truth. Not necessarily to defend the position that we happen to have, that was taught to us as children, or that our peer group may adopt, but where is the truth? And the willingness to step across the line and to join those that may seem alien to us, that hold beliefs that are not our beliefs, but as I pointed out at the beginning of the book, my father said, but on this point they're right. So I think that, for example, someone who's basically conservative may say that on certain environmental issues, the liberals are correct. That's perfectly, or the immigration issue. It seems to me that, I very often take a conservative view on something, but on the immigration issue, I tend to be more on the liberal side and say that we can't just ship them all back. I think we have to have a path to amnesty. I think that's a good thing. They're here. We have to deal with it. So I part company with people that I might otherwise agree with on other issues. So I think we want to get the book out because we want people to think for themselves
We don't take a stand in the book.
We don't take a stand in the book.
We also feel that it's important for pro-life people to understand why they're pro-life,
Yes.
and for pro-choice people to understand why they're pro-choice. Many times people just have a gut feeling, I'm this or I'm that, but they don't really know why. If you say, well, why are you pro-choice? Why are you pro-life? They can't really give you reasons. And they can't defend their position. So you could give this book to anyone. You could give it to a pro-life person, a pro-choice person, to help them understand where you're coming from, where they're coming from. You can, switch sides around and take a look at both sides, and then go from mixed feelings to rational thought and make a rational decision as to what is the truth of the issue.
It's so important to find out what people are thinking.
Not only what people are thinking, but what objectively, that is very important, certainly, right? But also what is objectively behind the position.
Yes.
Often the pro-life position is seen as a religious position, but I think it isn't that. We portray it as a civil rights issue. That it's not a religious issue, it's a civil rights issue. It's either the civil rights of women to make their own decisions, to lead their own lives, and not to have interference in decisions about reproductive freedom, or the right of the child to live. It's a civil rights issue, it's not a religious issue. So it is not a matter of simply following what you were taught. It is basing your position, in the case of pro-life, on philosophical reasons why abortion is wrong, namely that that's a person. As seen through the continuum argument, I am now the person that I am, and when I was 5 years old, I was a young child, but I was the same person, and going back still further, I was the same person in the womb, so you follow that argument out. Or the pro-choice view that says it's a biological organism, not a person, or the Judith Jarvis Thompson argument that the woman doesn't have to sustain it. So in all these cases, you are providing a foundation for the opinions that people have, and they don't float by themselves.
Speaking of truth, isn't there lying going on at counseling centers? They say maybe it's a blood clot size of a 50-cent piece.
They're not always honest. They have an agenda. They're selling a product, and unfortunately, when you have a product to sell, things get bent out of shape, unfortunately. Yeah.
I think going back, though, to the idea that it's not a religious issue primarily is very important. It doesn't mean that religious people, shouldn't take stands on things, and that it can't be connected to, belief in God. But that it's not primarily that is important, because it's obviously we're a pluralistic society, and someone is going to come along and say, well, it's nice you're religious,
right,
so you maybe don't believe in abortion,
yes,
but I'm an atheist, right, so I'm pro-choice. And it's important then,
yes,
so pluralistic society, you can't deal with that other than to say, leave it alone.
Yeah.
So that's why it's very important for people to recognize that this is not a religious issue, that it's a civil rights issue, a human rights issue. It's very important.
On page 178, the time is going so quickly. Page 178, you talk about abortion is either harmful or not harmful to the women. Interesting. In fact, there was a fascinating, on page 178, two quotes, one by, I think, a physician who had gone through, Dr. Julius Fogel, a psychiatrist and obstetrician and longtime advocate of abortion, who has himself performed over 20,000 abortions.
Shot on time.
Oh, we can't, he said every woman has a trauma at destroying a pregnancy. We're running out of time. There's a movie on the internet called 180themovie.com. Go there, you can see the movie. And the book is Understanding Abortion by Professor Stephen Schwarz and Kiki Latimer. Understanding Abortion. And for more information,
can you give them the 800 number?
Call 1-800-462-6420. 1-800-462-6420. 1-800-462-6420 for further information. Thank you.
Thank you. God loves you, and God loves the unborn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.